Hey, welcome back to Ecommerce On Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, how's it going this week?
I'm doing great, Nathan. How are you?
Amazing. So before we dive into this episode of Ecommerce On Tap, where we're diving into ByHeart, give first-time listeners a quick rundown of what Ecommerce On Tap is.
Yeah, so what we do is we find a very well-known industry or company. We tell their founding story, their market dynamics, and then reverse engineer their supply chain. So it's a lot of fun. I've certainly learned a lot of this season. I think you have too.
Oh yeah, it's been amazing. I think probably one of the coolest episodes we did actually was last week with Love Every, and we're kind of on this like baby theme right now, if you will. But before we dive into ByHeart, anything catch your eye this week? What kind of tidbits stood out to you?
Yeah, there was one that I saw a couple places, and that's that Target is selling their excess inventory on eBay and Poshmark. And so it was just a really interesting piece because it's I guess it's not technically Target, but there is a company that's highly affiliated with Target called Bullseye Deals, and they are a seller that I think on eBay has 137,000 followers, and they've sold something like 2.6 million items. And the interesting thing is that all of their stuff comes from Target. They are actually selling private label Target brands on the website. And it's just this really interesting piece because Target is looking at this as a liquidation channel. They know that, well, look, every retailer has excess stock at some point, and they can't really sell to places like TJ Maxx or other, discounters because those discounters are one going to be like, hey, if Target can't sell this, why, what makes you think I can do it? And even if they have some of their private label brands, they probably don't want those to be in certain channels as well. So this is a really interesting way that that Target is able to still have a high degree of control in the way that they're merchandised as they're being liquidated. And so I just think it's this interesting piece where once again, we're saying that e-commerce is a strategy. It's not the strategy for Target. Of course, they're going to be, own store retail and kind of their .com, but using it as an effective liquidation channel is something that I hadn't seen publicized in this large of a way before.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I do think retailers and a lot of companies in general are over inventoried. And so I know liquidation has been top of mind for many. I have a friend, D. Murphy, who runs Ghost, which is like a B2B liquidation marketplace. I know they raised a Series B, I think last year or the year before. And also Ryan Treft, who runs resale.com. Both are helping, big box retailers liquidate their items. I haven't seen a retailer, especially the size of Target, do this directly themselves, but super cool find, and really interesting to hear. What caught my eye this week is just how these brands have performed in the public market. So Groove Collaboration, a B Corp that sells eco-friendly household goods, reported that their revenue for 2024 was estimated to be 225 million, down 20%. But because they're spending less on ads, they're EBITDA neutral, and they have sufficient liquidity with $80 million in cash, and their market cap is only $56 million. So it's just kind of crazy to see how some of these brands are performing in the public markets. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Like that market cap does not reflect, the value of that business to me and probably most investors. But I mean, just curious your take hearing those numbers.
Yeah, Grove Collaborative is a fantastic company. We were lucky enough to work with them on a couple of things. We did a very large project, kind of launching them into retail, and it's a high quality team. And so I'm with you right there, where it seems that maybe there's a typo in the news. It seems like where you have $80 million of cash on the balance sheet, and the company is worth $56 million, even though you're not losing money. And so I know that they are kind of figuring out what they want to be when they grow up now that they're public and are trying to retool quite a few things. But it's just a little bit surprising, honestly, that is the way it is.
Yeah, it is. It is super surprising, but we'll see. We'll keep an eye on it. Well, let's dive into ByHeart. So, for those that don't know, ByHeart is a infant nutrition company dedicated to creating high quality, clinically proven infant formula. ByHeart took a very different approach to startups and e-commerce than many brands that we cover. They raised a ton of money just to get going. But before we dive into ByHeart and their founders and their story, Aaron, I know number one, one of their big competitors, Bobbie, very well. And also maybe let's dive in and give kind of a quick background of the history of feeding babies and how that this has impacted mortality rates.
Yeah, I think we should tell the audience too that between Nathan and I, we've had three kids. So they happen to all be my kids, but we have some background here. Um, as we were prepping for this episode, there was a couple key questions on my mind that I want to make sure I come back and get your perspective on. So the first one was, should you build a business to sell or build a business to endure? Because I think that when we look at Bobbie versus ByHeart, that's a real key kind of conversation that comes up in my mind. The second question is, what would motivate investors to line up and invest nearly $100 million in a pre-revenue product company? So not an AI company or a tech company, but a physical product company. And then the last question that was kind of on my mind that I want to get your perspective on at the end is, when is owning your own manufacturing a net positive or versus a net negative? And so those are just the thoughts on my mind. But kind of digging into ByHeart, they are an infant nutrition company, and they really were focused on building this high quality, clinically proven infant formula that was as close to the real thing as it could possibly be. And it's a really interesting story of some founders that seem to taken the most difficult path to where they are today, and they still have a long way to go. And it's an interesting juxtaposition with Bobbie, which took a different path, but ended up in a roughly similar spot right now. And so I think that I don't know. There's a lot here, and I'm just really interested to dig in with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty incredible story to see and compare how both companies have evolved and grown in different ways. But I think before we kind of tee this off, do you want to give a quick overview of kind of what the quick history of feeding babies looks like?
Yeah. So as you might suspect, the predominant way that children were fed was through breast milk. That's just kind of how we've been doing it since humans were humans. But that started to change a little bit in the 5th and 15th century, so in the Middle Ages. And the reality was that if a woman couldn't produce breast milk, then they either had to find someone else who could nurse the baby, or that baby just simply died. And in the Middle Ages, we started to tweak things a little bit, and they started to find that they could supplement breast milk with animal milk. And so whether they had a goat or a cow or a donkey, whatever was nearby, that's what they would use. And I think the interesting thing here is that the baby bottle wasn't invented until the 1800s. And so imagine if you've got some cow's milk and you're trying to feed it to your baby, and you don't really have a good vessel to do that. And so as an interesting kind of side note, I was curious how they fed babies this cow's milk or goat's milk before the bottle. And they actually found horns. They took horns from animals and perforated them, drilled holes in them, and then would kind of like pour the milk in one side and hopefully get enough of it into the baby's mouth. And so knowing how squirmy kids can be, I can just imagine that there wasn't a whole lot of milk that made it, from the vessel into the horn, into the baby's mouth. But that's what they did, because, as we'll find out later, you'll do pretty much anything to keep your kid alive.
Yeah. I mean, that is pretty crazy just to think about taking a horn and feeding your baby that way. And this whole industry has evolved so quickly, as we'll see. But I think, what caught my eye is, like, in the 16th to 17th century, medical professionals begin to emphasize the benefits of breastfeeding, right? And before that, it wasn't really widely known. And so, they had some wet nurses, as they would call them, that, would step in, and it became kind of a profession to do this, which was kind of interesting too.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And we find in like the 1600s, 1700s that was the first time that people started to supplement uh, non-milk things to babies. And so they would make this thing they called pap, which was kind of bread soaked in milk or cooked cereal and water. Think of it as basically the early type of baby food, and that's what they do to supplement. But things really started to change quite a bit in the 18th century. So this is the Industrial Revolution, and there were a lot of mothers that were working in factories. And because of wages and poor hygiene, things like that, breastfeeding became very challenging for a lot of women in the industrializing world. And unfortunately, because sterilization really wasn't a known thing, people didn't understand the concept of germs or things like that. A lot of these babies died, and they were trying to figure out how to solve this. And so I believe it's 1867 is when the first infant formula was developed by someone named Justus von Liebig. And he was one of the people who invented organic chemistry. And so I'm sure that there are lots of college students or engineering students out there that would hate this guy if they knew who he was. But his miracle formula was called Liebig soluble food for babies. And it was basically cow's milk, wheat flour, malt flour, and potassium bicarbonate. And so this really became this change in how babies were fed. So for millennia before, it was milk derivatives, things like that. And now we have something that is engineered. And I just want to pause for a moment because I don't think we can overstate how big of an impact this was to humanity in general. Do you want to talk about the chart that we found?
Yeah, I mean, so the mortality rate, just rises significantly once baby formula is invented, right? So if we go all the way back to like Rome 200 BC, about 50% of babies are dying, which is, devastating and just horrible to think about. But, starting in like the early mid 1800s, it's like 40% in Sweden, 41% in Belgium, and mortality rate, continues to rise. Whereas the global mortality rate in 2020 was 4.3%. So, it's pretty incredible to see this rate of innovation starting from 1867 when, baby formula was kind of first invented. Do you want to kind of give just now a quick history on baby formula?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it was basically 1 out of 2 babies died through like the beginning of time, and then once we have a different way to get babies those nutrients, that just drops. It becomes better by like 100-fold. And so in 1867, just a year after the first baby formula was invented, there was someone by the name of Henry Nestle. Remember that name, Nestle. He creates his first version of a baby formula, and it's basically cow's milk, wheat flour, and sugar. And the efficacy that Nestle's formula had in reducing infant mortality rates just really built this brand for Nestle, that this is a company that does good stuff and it's going to help you be healthy. And we see that they're still reaping those dividends today. And that company, that infant formula company, is now Nestle Global. And Nestle continues to use these scientific principles and product development to separate themselves from what's out there. Well, in 1883, the next kind of big innovation was that there was unsweetened evaporated milk, which becomes a popular base for homemade formulas. Before, you kind of had to have fresh milk, and so you would make this formula, but it wouldn't last a whole lot. In the 1910s, you start seeing things like dextromaltose, which is a different cow additive, which is you start to blend these things that more closely resemble humans' milk. So you're changing the cow's milk a little bit more. In the 1920s, 1930s, evaporated milk becomes really the standard. And because of its low cost, it becomes a really good avenue for kids. In the 1950s, you see your first non-powder formula hit the market. And this is really where formula goes from kind of something that's important, and if you needed it, you could go find it, to really mainstream. As the 1950s is when it really took off. The 60s, they start adding more stuff to these formulas. So you start seeing iron fortified formulas. The American Academy of Pediatrics starts to set guidelines for what formulas should be. And then the 1980s, there's finally a law passed by Congress, which is establishing baseline quality controls and things like that. And so it's been this really interesting piece where there was so much innovation. And the interesting dynamic is that companies were making money off of formula, but they weren't making money off of breast milk. And so you can imagine, if you are spending marketing dollars on something, you're probably going to spend it on the formula instead of the breast milk piece. And so it really created this big question of what is better, formula or breast milk?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to see how marketing kind of drives science in some ways, if you will. But I think what's crazy too that stood out to me is, did you know that about Nestle? I would guess that like 98% of people, maybe 99% of people, did not know that's how Nestle started. I mean, that is such a fascinating stat about Nestle, that they were kind of one of the early pioneers of baby formula.
Yeah, I think people might think like maybe Nesquik, which maybe they're a coffee company, but the infant formula thing is just really interesting. And I don't know. Personally, I'm really fascinated about these early product market fit things that happened 100 years ago that then propel these massive companies today, and just those origin stories.
Yeah, it is crazy. And as we'll see, kind of the history of baby formula and breast milk kind of collides in some sense. And it's not until the 1970s where the World Health Organization, the WHO, and UNICEF would adopt the International Code of Marketing Breast Milk Substitutes in 1981 to regulate marketing practices and avoid continuing confusion and misspread of misinformation about breastfeeding. Because it seems like all of these companies that were producing baby formula were basically telling families, hey, our baby formula is better than breastfeeding, when in fact it's been debated and might actually not actually be. And by the 21st century, a lot changed, right? So in the 2000s, there was increased awareness drastically for breastfeeding. The WHO and American Academy of Pediatrics recommend exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life. So this, as you can imagine, would be a shock for those baby formula companies. And then in the 2010s, public health campaigns and policies to promote breastfeeding were really top of mind through initiatives like the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative to aim at supporting breastfeeding mothers. And then in the 2020s, there's been continued advocacy for breastfeeding as the best source of infant nutrition. So this has kind of really changed in terms of the dynamic of what these companies are allowed to say when it comes to baby formula. And I mean, I'm curious, Aaron, you have 3 kids. What's been, your way of navigating, this kind of debate, if you will?
Yeah, I can tell from experience that this is a very sensitive and charged topic. I mean, the breastfeeding versus formula, you're talking about kids, you're talking about, first time mothers and fathers trying to figure out how to keep this kid that they had, from the hospital alive. And so it's very difficult. And I know that it can be very difficult for a family that maybe wants to breastfeed, but for one reason or another can't breastfeed. It can also be a very large burden for families that are only breastfeeding, because typically the mom is going to be doing 99% of the work and getting up and things like that. And so we were kind of joking earlier, what's better, breast milk or formula? Whatever your baby's eating, that's what's best, right? And I think that we've kind of gone through this evolution the last 20 years, like you're talking about, where we're recognizing that whether you choose formula or you choose breast milk, that's okay. And it used to be in the 70s and 80s that it was almost a socioeconomic change, where if you could afford to buy the formula, or if you could afford to have someone to help take care of your kid, you would go to the formula piece. And so there's these stigmas that really kind of beat down this a little bit. And we've tried to correct the pendulum and get back to a more healthy balance. So for us, we chose to formula feed. That was what worked well for us. I think the important part that I appreciated as a dad is that I felt that I could be more of a co-parent in that space, where if the baby needs to eat every 3 or 4 hours when they're first born, I could take some of those feedings, because I can make a formula bottle. I don't have to breastfeed or things like that. And so that's just how we did it. And I'm sure that every listener here who has kids has different stories and different experiences. And I think the important thing is as long as your kid is happy and healthy, that's okay.
Definitely, definitely. And I think it's interesting too to note the baby formula industry as a whole, right? Because, the industry in America has grown. I wouldn't say it's huge, but it is big, right? So it was a $3.1 billion industry in 2016, 4.5 billion in 2023, and it's expected to grow at about 3.25% up to 2028. So, I think the factors, some of which we've discussed, that contribute to this growth are increased awareness around infant nutrition, changing lifestyles of mothers, and more innovation around formula, right? As we'll discuss with ByHeart and how they, crafted their own formula, and also the expansion of e-commerce to better access formula. But, before the appearance of ByHeart, the US market has basically been covered by 4 large players. Number one, Abbott, which is, dominates with 48% market share. Meade Johnson coming in at number 2. Perrigo coming in at number 3. And of course, Nestle, which I'll say is my favorite, even though I'm not sure. But I just remember their chocolate milk growing up. And Nestle has 8%. So, there are other startup e-commerce players here like ByHeart, like Bobbie that we'll discuss as well. But I mean, you have, Aaron, quite a few different connections into this industry. What kind of insights have you learned from those people?
Yeah, this wasn't intentional, but as I was going through and preparing for this, I was like, oh, wait a minute. My brother-in-law's uncle used to run Abbott's infant formula business. Okay, that's interesting. I remember talking to him a little bit about that. And then I remember being an advisor to Bobbie's founders when they were first getting started and trying to figure out, do we build our own factory? Do we build something? Do we, license something overseas? Like, how do we get started? So had a lot of really good conversations with Laura and the team there. And then I actually remember having a couple meetings with Ron, one of the founders of ByHeart, in 2017, and just talking about supply chain and different strategies for when they were really just thinking about how to do this. And so it's really interesting that this, between being an active user of formula and knowing kind of these different players, this has become quite the personal episode for me.
Yeah, and I'm curious from your experience and talking to the other founders and leaders in the space, well, why is the market so hard to enter?
Yeah, I mean, like you were talking about, it's been so concentrated for so long. And, you think about it, there are very few companies or investors that are eager to jump into this industry. You're talking about the most highly regulated type of food for the most vulnerable people and the most emotional response, right? So if you think about the fact that if you have a bad formula and it injures or kills a baby, any death is bad, but killing a baby versus a 50-year-old or a 100-year-old, like that's just so much worse, right? Because it just is. And so you think about this, and formula is also something that you don't use forever. It's a very limited amount of time where a child is going to consume formula, and you're really tied to the nation's birth rates. And I think one of the things that was interesting about the statistics you were sharing is that even though the market has gone up, the U.S. birth rate has actually declined pretty dramatically since I think it was like 2007, 2008. And so just there's some fundamental market dynamics that make you wonder, like, is this a growth market? Do I really want to invest in this? The other thing is that there are a lot of regulatory hurdles in this space. So there are extremely high tariffs for any formula coming in. So this prevents foreign players from entering the market. The regulations, like we talked about, are very, very strict because of the client, the consumer, right, is defenseless. There's a couple European brands that are blacklisted for one reason or the other. And even you think about the USMCA, the new NAFTA treaty, that basically discourages large manufacturers like Canada from exporting baby formula to the US. And so it's this really difficult piece. And, just the role of regulation in this concentration is really interesting. Do you want to talk about WIC?
Yeah. I mean, it's been pretty fascinating to see just how regulated this is. And, we couldn't talk about this industry without talking about WIC. WIC, for those that don't know, is the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infant, and Children. And it's a federally funded program that provides grants to states to ensure that low-income pregnant women have access to food for their children. And so the program is administered by state agencies, and they purchase more than half of all infant formula supply in the United States. So pretty much 50% of infant formula that's sold is going through this WIC program, which is just astronomical to think about it. And only 3 companies have the chance to participate in the program: Abbott, Meade Johnson, and Nestle. So those are the 3 that are in the program. And so these state agencies can't just buy formula from any manufacturer. They have to, by law, have a competitive bid process for contracts and select one company, and one of which then becomes the exclusive provider of that formula for all WIC recipients in the state. So, I mean, talk about a huge government contract that, if you're one of these baby formula companies, you want to do everything you can to win. This is it. I mean, it's pretty crazy because this, I think, sets the tone for how regulated and how governmentally controlled, this whole industry is. But, now that we've kind of established that, I think we should dive into ByHeart.
Let's do it.
So do you want to start with the founder history and then we'll go from there?
Yeah, so ByHeart was founded in 2016, and they were founded by Mia Funt and Ron Belgrum. And the interesting thing about is that Mia and Ron are actually siblings. I don't know if we've covered some family members working together, but I don't think we've had a brother sister pair that we've researched. But Mia, she got a BA in political science and philosophy at UPenn. She spent 5 years in strategy consulting, where she talked about how she was digging into difficult problems and figuring out how to solve them. She spent some time in Rwanda working with entrepreneurs. She spent some time at AOL and Verizon, and really just has this good background in marketing and strategy and things like that. And she's also a mother of three, so she's living this day in and day out. Ron, her brother, has a BA in biology, also at UPenn, and he got a minor in healthcare management. He's always been someone that has been drawn to health and life sciences and things like that. He spent 8 years as an investor, really focused on the pharma, biotech, and consumer health sector. And for another 8 years, he started, he was a managing partner of Consumer Health Ventures, where he was building and investing in businesses that improve lives. And that background in biotech and tech and healthcare investing really was his foundation. He has, I think, the permission to really speak authoritatively on a lot of these scientific things because he spent so much time with these experts and digging into what works. And so, they are a really interesting pair, this brother-sister piece. And I'm just curious from your perspective. We talked about how it's not uncommon for family members to start a business together, but it seems rare that one, you have two siblings that have such a complementary skill set, with one being sales and marketing or a community builder and the other one having a deep understanding of science. How difficult do you think it might have been, especially knowing the full ByHeart story, which you haven't gotten to pair a technical and a marketing co-founder if they hadn't been siblings? Because those just seems like they're cut from two different pieces of cloth.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's interesting just to see how this sibling duo works together. And I think they really complement each other. I think, like you said, had Ron not had an experience with consumer health ventures, ByHeart probably wouldn't have come to mind. I think that he saw a gap in the market. And then Mia, as she's having her first children, realized, hey, there's no real infant formula that really resonates with me. And probably together they saw this gap in the market and decided to start ByHeart. I mean, I think that's kind of how the story goes. But I think it's interesting to see, siblings work together always, because I know for me, I have an older sister. I don't think I could ever work with her, to be honest.
Yeah, I can understand that. So, my wife and I tried to work together for a little bit, and we decided that we're better off being married than business partners. And so, we don't do that. But I work with family members, and it's worked out really well. So, I guess it depends on the family member, and it depends on the dynamic. But really the interesting thing, and this comes back to some of the conversations I remember having with Ron when they were first thinking about this, is the thing that struck me and left such an impression even today is how motivated they were to find something that could be just as good or as close as real breast milk as actual breast milk. So when you look at the formula market today, everything is a little bit different. And the reason why pediatricians and other NGOs will say, hey, use breast milk is because it is better, right? If you can get it, it is better, especially, coming from a mother to their child. And they were so passionate about trying to find what were the different dynamics, proteins, things that they could do in order to make this. And so that was really their first hard decision they made, was that they wanted to find something that really was as close to the real thing as it could be, as opposed to finding a good formula, something that had been out there, and just creating a new millennial focused brand. And we'll kind of come back to this a little bit, but that second piece was the decision that Bobbie made, and they've had tons of success and have built a great business by doing that. But here ByHeart intentionally, in some ways, decided to forego that revenue and focus in on their product. And I guess the question I have for you is when do you think it makes sense to try to partner and try to establish product market fit in your brand versus deciding that, hey, I want to build all this infrastructure, I want to build all this IP myself?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think in ByHeart's case, because they set out trying to create a completely new formula, they kind of had to go this route of going at it themselves. I mean, they did try to partner with existing manufacturers, but those manufacturers just weren't interested in going about that route to create a better quality, more clinically proven formula like ByHeart has done. And so, to me, I think most of the time it's best to work with a contract manufacturer off the bat. But we've covered, was it Harry's that bought their own manufacturer pretty early on? That was another great episode of Ecommerce on Tap where we discussed Harry's and how they vertically integrated with their German manufacturer pretty early on. And so ByHeart does this from the get-go, but I don't quite know if it was intentional, because they did start by asking different CMs if they would work with them on a new formula.
Yeah. I think that they had such a conviction that this is what they wanted to do, that this was the company that was worth building. And kind of all these other decisions were made, maybe not intentionally all at once, but because of this core motivation they have. And so they spent an enormous amount of time and effort researching breast milk, its benefits, the components, all those sorts of things. And what they zeroed in on for what was going to be different was the actual protein. And so instead of looking for an easy source to obtain protein, which would be whey protein, which is the byproduct of wheat and things like that, they decided that they wanted to rewrite the protein matrix, which I've seen the movie Matrix. I don't know what it takes to rewrite a protein matrix, but I know it took a lot of time. And so they had to hire really this world-class team of experts who would work on this. They had PhDs and really qualified people, which are not cheap, to kind of work on these. And luckily, Ron had a lot of these connections. He knew who to go to initially, and he, because of his past experience, not only knew the science but also knew the regulatory experts he needed to talk to. And so they started to do this, and it took them 5 years from when they decided that this was what they were going to do. They wanted to make something that was as close to real breast milk as possible, to getting their market out there. And my question for you is given that most venture funds typically operate on a 7-year fund cycle, what sorts of milestones do you think these investors needed to see in order to keep their interest, right? You think that they came out and said this is a 5-year R&D play, or did it just happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably happened slower than they originally had planned, but the investors were on this road with them and their team, right? And so they saw the progress they were making, they saw the new proteins they were formulating, they saw the clinical trials, and they saw the progress, and they decided to continue to invest, right? So, I mean, it's a lot different than other e-commerce stories we cover here, because they emphasize product development for the first 5 years and don't launch a product, for that time period, right? So it's kind of crazy to think about, because I think if you asked most kind of e-commerce oriented founders, are you willing to spend 5 years of your company's life developing your product and then launching? Most people would be like, you're crazy. Like, I want to get a product in market. I want to launch, let's start getting customers. But in this specific case with ByHeart, you just couldn't go out and launch any baby formula, right? Number one, that wouldn't be right. And number two, you would just be differentiating yourself from like a marketing perspective, which is really not what, ByHeart set out to do. They wanted to create their own formula from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think too that you have to have the right investors for this as well. I would imagine that most of the investors in the way that that Ron and Mia talked about the business was really more from a biotech or a pharma lens, where, hey, we know we're going to spend a lot of money. We know that the science here is hard. We're literally doing something that hasn't been done before. And so we need you to go on this journey with us. We don't know if it's going to take 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, but we believe that if we're able to get this right, this is going to be such a massive improvement in outcomes, valuable business, et cetera. And so I believe that that was probably a really important piece as well, is that they selected the investors early on that were willing to kind of take a longer view pharma approach, as opposed to someone that said, hey, just show me the CAC LTV, get some subscription stuff on there, and I want you to be launched and sold within 4 years.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I completely agree. And the product that they ended up deciding to launch was free of a lot of sugars, and had just great ingredients compared to other baby formulas on the market. But before they launched their own formula, to get more insights on their product and I think build kind of a initial community, they launched Cluster in 2021, which was a digital product looking to support new parents and build a community around the challenges of early parenthood. And so Cluster was and is their subscription service that provides a range of export resources and products to parents during the critical first few months of a baby's life. And I think it was really a great way for them to start building community as a company and just build credibility and connect with parents and gain more insights prior to them actually launching, their own formula.
Yeah, I think so. And it kind of feels like everybody has a community, or at least is trying to have a community today. Do you think we're approaching? We had peak subscription a couple of years ago. Are we approaching peak community in your opinion?
In some ways, yes. I mean, I do think it's a strong strategy to launch because you can connect with your customer before really having your product in market, which is what ByHeart did and did so successfully. So I think it was intentional. I think for the most part, there's a lot of different ways to build community in today's market, right? Whether it be a creator-led brand, whether it be through a newsletter, there's so many different ways, or even through a podcast, right? Through Ecommerce On Tap. I mean, this is essentially a community for ISBA and Sourcify. We get a lot of listeners that hear about Sourcify and ISBA through Ecommerce On Tap.
Yeah. Well, do you think that Cluster was a pivot, or something they planned to do all along?
My gut tells me there was probably some like pressure they were feeling of like, hey, we want to get something in market to showcase to our investors and our team. And also it made sense to have a early way to connect with potential customers. So to me, I think it was a win-win for them. But, I wouldn't say they probably planned to launch Cluster when they started ByHeart.
Yeah. I can imagine there's probably some pressure where they needed to show some sort of revenue, needed to maybe not keep raising money. So we get to they raised quite a bit of money. I think one of the things that's really interesting about ByHeart and the way that they came to market is in the way that they approach clinical trials. And so they wanted to be able to prove that what they were building was truly better than what was on the market. And so they wanted to prove this to both their customers and the FDA. And so they commissioned some very long, extensive, some of the most thorough clinical trials that had ever been conducted in the formula industry. And so they were able to prove that their formula was more easily digestible than others. They had studies that were published in peer-reviewed magazines. Basically, what the FDA did was they followed babies for, I think, up to 4 months. That's the normal request. But ByHeart decided to follow them for 6 months, so 50% longer. They collected stool samples, blood samples, and they tracked 100 babies for the testing, which is a pretty big number. You think about like how many times you have to be getting samples and things like that. These babies were being looked at, probably a couple times a week, a couple times a month. But in 2022, they launched their product in the middle of the baby formula crisis, and I remember this. We were kind of in between kids. We were expecting our third when this was happening. And it was kind of scary. You think back to the chart that we referenced about infant mortality rates being 50% without formula. And suddenly we get thrust into not something that was as dire as that, but people were certainly feeling about this, like what happened. And this crisis happened in 2022, and it was triggered by the recall of several products that were manufactured by Abbott. There was, I think, I forget exactly what the microbe was that they found, but basically, Abbott, which has close to 50% market share, pulled back a lot of capacity, stopped producing, and took a lot of supply out. And this was a scary shock. And between the recall and then COVID supply chain issues, there was just massive shortages. There were empty shelves. There were people that were reselling formula online for hundreds of dollars, and the FDA and the government were like, "Oh crap! What do we do? How do we fix this?" And you think about this is an important thing because baby formula is, for many, the sole source of nutrition for a baby. And so, if you're a parent and you've done literally everything you can to keep this thing happy and taken care of, once you don't have that formula or literally any formula, it gets really stressful and really, really scary. And it was so much so that President Biden convened a lot of the baby formula manufacturers to the White House to try to figure out, how do we fix this, right? How do we fix this without increasing prices? And because Mia and Ron were a manufacturer, they were invited and had a same seat at the table as Abbott and Johnson Meade and Nestle and things like that. And so it was a very tumultuous time, but also a really good opportunity for ByHeart to kind of come to market at this point in time, because consumers were literally willing to try anything, and they got to know the product, and they were able to see that people were willing to give it a shot, and they kind of came back to it because kids liked it. And so they had made this decision early on, which we kind of glanced over, that in order to build the formula that they wanted, they had to build their own factory. And I think that was an expensive endeavor. It was something that I'm sure along the way they wondered, should we have done this? And I'm wondering if you were in their position and you find yourself kind of on this 5-year journey, and then you launch and you're in this middle of this crisis, and now you're at the White House sitting across from these really big competitors. Do you think that there's a sense of vindication and that owning their factory was the way to go? Or do you think this was just kind of dumb luck?
I mean, I think there has to be, right? Because I don't know if they quite set out to own their factories from day one, but I'm sure it was on their long-term roadmap, right? And so it made sense. They timed it exceptionally well. Was that lucky? Of course, but they executed well, right? So I think they really made the most of that moment. And what's crazy to think about too is that when they launched, they became the first baby formula company to be approved by the FDA in the last 15 years. So, I mean, just a huge achievement by their team to think about that process. And, at the time when they launched, they were, of course, focused on helping ramp up production. So having their own factory definitely helped with that. And the critical support they got from government officials was also super beneficial. But, I think that's really kind of a dynamic of timing, luck, and execution, if you ask me.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned execution because there were quite a few things that unfortunately didn't go well in their supply chain. And so particularly in 2023, so they had really built their ethos and company around quality, their unique manufacturing process, things like that. And they actually took their sales down. They stopped selling in 2023 to deal with some of the supply chain issues that had popped up. At this point, they had initially launched one factory. They purchased 2 more. And again, this is a highly regulated enterprise. And so the FDA is going to audit you. And as a result of one of these audits, the FDA kind of strongly encouraged that they have a voluntary recall for some discrepancies that were there. And they actually issued a warning letter after several stages. Are you familiar with the warning letter process and kind of how big of a deal this is?
I mean, it's a huge deal. I'm not completely familiar with the process, but I know, as soon as the FDA sends a warning letter, you basically should, halt selling that product, which is what they did, right?
Yeah, I mean, the warning letter itself doesn't say that you have to stop selling, but it's not a good thing. So basically, it's a public record where the FDA says, hey, we're looking at this company. We found that, these are the standards that you're supposed to be abiding by. Our audit analysis shows that you're not abiding by them. And so you have, we have a plan to fix it. You need to do it. And so the warning letter kind of precedes a secession letter where basically if they don't show corrective actions, they don't fix things, they don't take it seriously, then the FDA can say, like, yeah, you can't sell in this country anymore. So that's a big deal. And so the warning letter is, you can find it online, right? Like you can search it, it'll be there. And so this was really kind of an unfortunate step back after really 5 years of great work figuring out the science. Now they're trying to put it together from a supply chain point of view.
Yeah, yeah, it is pretty crazy. I mean, looking back on ByHeart too, I think it's interesting to look at their company timeline, right? So 2016, the company's founded. 2019, they have a debt financing of 22 million. 2020, they have a Series A with 7 investors for 70 million, and that's led by D1 Capital Partners, as well as OCV and Polaris Partners. 2021, a Series B for 90 million, led by D1 Capital Partners. That's when they launched their first digital product cluster, and the company receives FDA approval for their formula. Their revenue is only estimated to be 3.5 million at this point, though. But March 2022, the whole nutrition infant formula is launched during this crisis. And December, the product is voluntarily recalled because of this bacteria risk that they faced. And their revenue is estimated to be about $6.87 million. 2023, they do a venture round with one investor for undisclosed sum, and the FDA issues a warning letter to ByHeart, and their revenue drops to 1.3 million or so, because they had to do some product recall and halt production. In 2024, they do another round with 8 investors for 95 million. That was announced about 2 weeks ago. So you add all those.
Yeah, how much have they raised?
Yeah,
I'm
you
trying
add
to
all that
imagine.
up, it's $395 million
Wow.
which is pretty crazy to think about. I mean, I think on the other hand, could you have potentially spent that money more efficiently to get to this point from a revenue perspective? Yes, but could you have gotten FDA approval? Can you had owned your own facilities? I mean, in my view, a lot of that capital was used for the formulation, the FDA process, as well as their manufacturing facilities, which are real assets, right? So something to think about. Let's talk about their assets and their supply chain as a company. Do you want to dive into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So they, and again, I like 395 million. I'm just trying to wrap my head. That's a lot of money, and kudos to them for having the investors that were willing to bet on them over and over again. I think the key thing here is, again, they wanted to make something that was empirically as good as breast milk, and because nothing like that existed, they knew they had to design that themselves. Because they wanted to change the protein matrix, they knew that they were going to have to find different processes and different feedstocks. And so it was really incumbent upon them to have a completely vertically integrated model. And so ByHeart controls their entire production process, from ingredient sourcing all the way to final production and packaging and things like that. And this is a difficult thing to kind of think about. Again, like you said, they are the first manufacturer in 15 years to have their own manufacturing from the ground up. And yeah, I think it's one of these things where they've got 3 factories today, and we'll just kind of get to your perspective. Do you think it was wise for them to own their own factory and build out that network versus just focusing on product and trying to find someone to produce it themselves?
I mean, I think in the long term, yes, because they have so much more power and capabilities to innovate compared to if they were just to partner with a contract manufacturer. I mean, I think in the short term, obviously they face challenges. They face supply chain issues with, recall that led to this FDA, warning letter. So, I mean, I think long term, I do foresee this playing out for them because there has been in the past, limited supply and shortages of baby formula. And, I do think it's a good investment to, vertically integrate in this case. If this was a t-shirt brand or a backpack brand or something of that nature, I don't see this being a strategic advantage. But in ByHeart's case, for this specific industry of baby formula, I think it's a strategic advantage.
Yeah. Yeah, you're probably right there, and I think we'll see how that plays out. As far as business model is concerned, so ByHeart is a D2C company. They offer a subscription as well as kind of one-off purchases, and the thought is that, well, because of all the money that they've had to spend in it, and because it's just formula in general, they have a premium or a high price point for the product, and so typically for these sorts of things, they offer a lot of buy now, pay later, pay with installment sort of thing. And from a component perspective, they're getting some tins and lids and things from China. But really, the formula itself, for all intents and purposes, it is U.S. manufacturing. Headquarters are in New York. Their manufacturing facilities are, I think, in Pennsylvania, Oregon, and Iowa. And I think it's too early to talk about an exit. But I wanted to take some time and just walk through the value creation strategy between ByHeart and Bobbie. Before we do that, do you have any kind of feedback on their supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to see that they vertically integrated, right? I mean, I think we'll see how it plays out because I think the market from a revenue standpoint for them is still very early. They've spent, the first half of their company just formulating and building product and getting FDA approval. And now that they've achieved that, it's time to go to market and try to scale this up. So I'm really curious to hear how this compares to Bobbie because, I mean, from what I know of Bobbie, they have less venture dollars, but a lot more revenue. So it's interesting to compare the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that both of these companies are going to be successful. They're going to be in roughly the same spot from a different path would be my estimation. But uh, as we talked about, ByHeart was started in 2016. Bobbie was started in 2018, and ByHeart raised $395 million, and Bobbie raised a modest 142 million, which is still a crap ton of money. But I think the interesting piece here was in how they differentiated themselves in their product strategy. So ByHeart was focused really almost entirely on a new formula that mimics all of the positive properties of breast milk. That is what they want to do. They recognized that they were going to have to spend a significant amount of R&D to develop the formulation, to figure out a new manufacturing process. But that was their thought, was that we want to find something that is just as as good as breast milk, if not very close to it. Bobbie, on the other hand, focused on bringing European style formulas to the US. And so they didn't want to reinvent something, wanted to find something that was doing well in Europe, something that could be easily licensed with a 510K here in the US, and basically import that as that part. So that was the first kind of big separation point. ByHeart, as we talked about, owns 3 facilities, most of which they've built from the ground up. And Bobbie initially was partnering with Rigo, but just recently with their $100 million round that they just closed, they purchased a facility in Ohio, and so now they own their own manufacturing piece. And so interesting, different product strategy perspectives, kind of ending up at the same spot and same conclusion that owning your factory is the right thing to do. From a revenue perspective, it's a very big divergence. So ByHeart, as we talked about, did just under $7 million in 2022 before they had to pause their production and pull things back. Whereas last year in 2023, Bobbie did over $100 million in sales. And, from a valuation perspective, it's hard to know what ByHeart's is. They were $100 million in 2020. This is before their launch and before they raised more money. But Bobbie is estimated to be around $388 million. And so it's very interesting when you compare these two because, well, Nathan, I guess I'd ask you is like, who do you think has the bigger upside here? And is it different than who you would maybe bet on right now?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, well, if you think about how e-commerce companies are valued, right, it's typically based on revenue and EBITDA, right? So Bobbie is definitely in a better position from a valuation standpoint. And now they've gone out and bought their own manufacturer. So I don't think that's necessarily a competitive advantage to ByHeart anymore because Bobbie owns one of its own facilities right now. So we'll see how it plays out, right? I think ByHeart, is now just kind of ramping up their marketing spend from what I've seen, on their social media. But, they have a very strong base and foundation to build on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that right now Bobbie is the more attractive company to be an investor in, but I think that ByHeart has a potentially higher upside by a lot. And if you think about this, and going back to the thought of, Bobbie had investors that more closely mimicked e-commerce, traditional e-commerce or CPG investors. ByHeart was more of a biotech pharma play. And in that playbook, you are going to spend a lot of money. You're going to waste a lot of money as you try different things that don't work out. But once you find a formula, a compound, some sort of thing that has a dramatic improvement on human health, then suddenly this is a winner takes most market. And we could see something where if this formula is as good as they claim it is, and if they're able to produce it at the level of quality they need to, then suddenly there could be something here where we're looking back 5 years from now, and the ByHeart formulation is the predominant formulation in this entire ecosystem. And so even though you look at it and say, wow, they spent $400 million to make 7, that's not a great return. Really, their value is in this IP of the product and in doing something that really was truly innovative. And so I think that, I'd rather own Bobbie right now. I would probably want to invest in ByHeart today because I think that there is a much higher upside there if they can, easy to say, but execute on all the supply chain pieces they need to do.
Yeah, it's an interesting take, and we'll see how it plays out. I mean, in review, I think we should come back to those kind of original questions that you had asked. So, number one, you asked, how should you build a business to sell versus build a business to endure? I'm curious, do you have a quick take on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to having alignment with your founders, your employees, and your investors. I think that as Bobbie and ByHeart have both shown, you can build a very meaningful business and raise a substantial amount of money in either perspective. And I know that the Bobbie team probably wouldn't say like, hey, we're just here to sell. But I think that they're in a better position to get a better multiple and to sell sooner. And really, they are a brand, right? They're using a formulation that, for all intents and purposes, has been around, has been tried and proven. People will buy Bobbie because they like Bobbie. For ByHeart, they're building something that is really binary. Like it's either going to go really well or it's going to go really poorly. And if again, like we talked about, if they can get it to the point where this formulation really takes off, then it's kind of game over from a valuation perspective because they're just going to knock it out of the park. So I think it's really, you have to make sure that your investors are signed up for this, because the last thing you want to do is find an investor who is looking for a payback in 6 or 7 years, and you try to play the biotech playbook and say, hey, yeah, how's 20 to 30 sound for you?
Yeah, it makes sense. And secondly, you asked what motivates investors to line up to invest nearly $100 million in a pre-revenue product company. I think from my viewpoint, real quick, I would consider ByHeart to date more of a biotech, right? I mean, to get FDA clinical approval for a formula and be the first company to do that in the last 15 years, to me, it's more of a biotech investment. And, you hear biotech companies raising tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars before they have a product in market. I mean, you even have publicly traded biotechs that don't have any product in market that are still, going through clinical trials and trying to get FDA approval. So in that industry of biotech, it's actually relatively normal. And, obviously a lot different if you consider this an e-commerce company, which, to date, I think they're maturing into be more of an e-commerce company, but originally they started more as a biotech.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because if you look at them as a biotech and hold them accountable to those peers, they're actually pretty capital efficient. They've only spent $400 million and they have a
Yep.
factory, they have a formula, and they have a business. Whereas, if you're trying to develop a new weight loss drug, you may spend billions of dollars and not have much to show for it.
Totally. And last but not least, I'm curious to hear your take on when is owning your own manufacturing a net positive versus a net negative?
I think it's a net positive when it works, right? So the downside is if you own your own manufacturing and it doesn't go well, you can't really leave. You have to fix it, right? Where if you're using a third party and you have an issue, you can fire that partner, you can go elsewhere, you can do those sorts of things. So everybody looks at the benefits of the control and the cost. Personally, I would always tend to say, hey, find somebody who's only going to focus on manufacturing and partner with them as opposed to building yourself, because you just have much limited options if you have a supply chain that's not executing well.
Totally. Well, I'm curious, for our listeners on this episode of E-commerce on Tap, which would you invest in if you had to invest today? And which one do you think is going to have a bigger outcome, ByHeart or Bobbie? Thank you again for listening in to this episode of E-Commerce on Tap, brought to you by Source Find ISBA. Aaron and I want to hear from you. Message us or post about us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We're both very active on those platforms. And leave a review, share this with a friend. We really appreciate you listening in to E-Commerce on Tap, brought to you by Source Find ISBA. We'll hear from you next time.